dear friends. Today, we are going to share a story that will blow your mind. On the first night of marriage, the groom did something that caused him to suddenly transform into a dog. But that was just the beginning. After that, a strange and terrifying relationship developed between a jinn's love and the dog, which will completely confuse you. Where did this horrifying event end? Stay with us till the end of this story to discover all its secrets. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It was the final hours of the night, and the king was deeply immersed in worship in his chamber. He was so lost in the remembrance of Allah that he couldn't hear any external sounds or movements. Since the Isha prayer, he had been in a peaceful state of worship, and his soul felt an extraordinary tranquility and contentment. He was a great king, but in his heart he always had the spirit of a simple man. Those who were close to him knew that although the king's power was unmatched, he never allowed his position to become a cause for arrogance or pride. Outside the chamber, 2 soldiers stood guard as usual, assigned to protect him. The king's physical strength and bravery were such that he could single-handedly fight off enemies, but he never misused his power. He always valued the service of his people and considered their cooperation necessary for his protection. The king's way of leadership was gentle and friendly. His attitude was never filled with arrogance. He treated all his soldiers, ministers, and the public like an ordinary human being. Under his rule, no one had ever been dishonored, and no one had misused their power. His principles were strict, and anyone who violated them would certainly be punished. But these punishments were never harsh or beyond one's endurance. The king always believed that a good ruler is one who respects his people and always does justice by them. Suddenly, the king's worship was interrupted. There was a soft knock on the door of the chamber, which was an unusual occurrence for the king. At that moment, he was completely focused on his worship, and this time was very precious to him. He immediately rose from his prayer mat and opened the door. Standing outside were 2 soldiers and the minister. All 3 of them respectfully greeted him and asked for permission to enter. The king was tired and wanted to rest, but the minister's anxious and troubled expression made him more cautious. As he opened the door, he said, "Come in. Tell me what is troubling you." There was a visible distress in the minister's eyes, and his speech seemed hesitant. The king immediately realized that something unusual was happening, as the minister's worry was evident. Looking at the minister, the king said, "If your life is at risk, then tell me immediately what the matter is." The minister hesitated and then said, "Your Majesty, if you allow me, I would like to report something." The king nodded and permitted him to speak. The minister began, "Your Majesty, I was just outside, and what I saw with my own eyes, I believe it is crucial for you to know." The king listened attentively, and his eyes filled with both astonishment and anger as the minister spoke. The words that came from the minister's mouth were beyond the king's comprehension. What he was about to hear seemed almost impossible. The minister explained, "Your Majesty, not long ago, I witnessed something that was very disturbing. The bond between a man and a dog, and the actions that followed. This is no ordinary matter." The king immediately narrowed his eyes and asked, "What are you saying? What connection could there possibly be between a man and a dog? How is this even possible?" The minister went on to explain the details and tried to convince the king of what he had witnessed. Waves of different thoughts surged through the king's mind, and for a few moments he was completely silent. The king then looked at the minister sternly and said, "Is this true? You are not lying to me, are you?" The minister lowered his head and replied, "Your Majesty, I would rather die than lie to you." The minister's voice carried the determination of a true and loyal servant. The king looked at him closely, then asked, "Why did you go on patrol alone?" The minister raised his head and responded, "Your Majesty, I felt that this matter was so urgent that I needed to inform you immediately. This issue will surely reach your court, because the reaction was so strong that it could not be hidden." The king listened carefully to the minister's words, and a flicker of anger and astonishment appeared in his eyes. The king then took a deep breath and said, "We must conduct a thorough investigation into this matter. No stone should be left unturned, as it involves the honor of our people and our principles." He turned to the minister and said, "You didn't inform me sooner." The minister lowered his head again, replying softly, "Your Majesty, I didn't want to disturb you during such a critical moment, so I went out quietly on my own. If it displeased you, I apologize. I promise I won't do anything without your permission in the future." The king smiled gently and placed his hand on the minister's shoulder, saying, "We are proud to have you as our minister. Your sense of responsibility and your standing in our army are unparalleled. You have always understood our troubles and stood by us through every hardship. Your every action is invaluable to us." The minister, moved by the king's words, raised his head, a smile spreading across his face. He bowed deeply and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your trust means the world to me." After a final, respectful salute, the minister left the chamber. The king returned to his chamber, pondering the minister's words. He still couldn't understand whether the minister's report was based on truth or just a rumor. The question weighed heavily on his mind. Was there really something happening among his people that he was unaware of? He sat for a long time, lost in thought, considering the minister's words and their implications. Suddenly, the call for Fajr prayer echoed, stirring a new energy in the king. He immediately rose and performed his Fajr prayer. Afterward, he left the chamber and entered his bedroom where his wife was deep in sleep. The king gazed at her for a moment, then gently lay beside her. Within moments, he too drifted into a peaceful sleep. A few hours later, the sun had risen. The king's eyes opened, and he got up to take a bath. The early morning light infused him with renewed vigor. After breakfast, he set off for the court. Throughout the journey, he chatted with his wife, discussing matters that would remain between them forever. When the king entered the courtiers immediately stood up from their seats to honor him. With dignity, the king walked to his seat. As his footsteps echoed, the courtiers all shouted in unison, "Long live the king!" A soft smile appeared on the king's face, but deep down he knew that behind that smile lay a great responsibility. Step by step, he made his way to the throne, where the courtiers waited for permission to sit. The king gave a sweeping look to everyone in the room, and then spoke in a loud, clear voice, "Peace be upon you all. Welcome." After that, he allowed everyone to take their seats. Once seated, the king began the day's court proceedings. As was his custom, he inquired about the well-being of his courtiers and addressed their concerns. The king always cared for his courtiers, trying to resolve their problems. If a matter was minor, it was resolved immediately. However, if the matter was more significant, it was postponed until the next day. The king always made sure that his people were never disappointed. During this time, a woman entered the court with a dog. The king found this scene very strange. Dogs were considered impure, and it was unacceptable for one to be brought into the court. The king immediately signaled to his soldiers to allow the woman into the court, knowing that women always deserved respect. However, it was hard for him to understand why she had brought a dog with her. The woman walked directly to stand in front of the king's seat. The dog was with her, and she stood next to it, looking at it. The king's heart stopped for a moment. He gazed at the woman deeply, then shifted his gaze to the dog. For a moment, it felt as though time had frozen. He knew there must be some purpose behind this, but it was still unclear to him. The king asked the woman, "Why have you come? And why have you brought this dog into our court?" In response, the woman lowered her head and said, "Your Majesty, this dog is very important to me. I cannot come without it." The king took a deep breath, trying to understand the woman's circumstances. A question lingered in his mind. Was this woman telling the truth, or was there some hidden secret behind her actions? The king looked at the woman carefully, and then glanced at the dog. His eyes were filled with unusual curiosity. He then asked again, "Woman, why have you come here? And with an animal that is considered impure? Do you not know that dogs are not allowed in our court?" Upon hearing this, the woman looked at the king and suddenly fell to her knees, crying bitterly. Her eyes were filled with despair and pain, and her hands kept rubbing the dog's back as if comforting it. The king found her behavior very strange, and without thinking, he stood up from his seat and walked towards her. In a soft tone, he said, "Do not behave this way. Whatever your problem is, tell us. We will do our best to help you. But if you continue to waste our time and yours in this manner, it will be wrong." The woman heard the king's words and, still crying, said, "Your Majesty, I do not know whether you will be able to solve my problem, but I have come to you with a great hope and expectation. Please solve my problem and bring my husband back to me." The king, astonished, asked, "What kind of problem could we not solve? And where is your husband that you want us to bring back to you? Whatever it is, tell us in detail so we can understand and take action." The woman listened to the king's question, then stood up to express her pain. The king watched her closely and then returned to his seat. The woman looked the king in the eye as she began speaking. "Your Majesty, something strange has been happening to me for the past few days. I have been married for only 5 months, and this problem began on the night of our wedding. Before that, nothing like this had ever happened." The king gave a slight nod, listening intently to the woman's story. She continued, "On the night of our wedding, when I left my parents' house and came to my husband's home, I heard a frightening noise in the room. But I ignored it because it was my wedding night, and I didn't want to pay too much attention to such things. But the next morning, when I got up to prepare breakfast for my husband in the kitchen, I heard the sound of a newborn baby crying. I immediately ran out of the kitchen and saw a small baby crying on the bed. I was terrified and thought, where did this baby come from?" The woman continued, "At first, I wanted to go to the baby, but I suddenly felt an intense fear. I went back inside and told my husband that there was a baby crying outside. He looked at me in surprise and said, 'Are you out of your mind?'" The woman continued, "My husband tried to convince me that I was imagining things, but I immediately corrected him. I took his hand and led him outside. But when we got outside, the shocking sight awaited me. The child who had been crying on the bed just moments ago was no longer there." The king listened carefully to her words, trying to understand the woman's situation. He was lost in thought, wondering if there was truth in her story and if she was going through something beyond her understanding. Numerous questions filled his mind, but he still couldn't fully grasp what was happening to this woman. "Did you share this incident with anyone else?" the king gently asked. The woman lowered her head and replied, "No, Your Majesty, I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid people would think I was crazy, but now, as this continues to happen, I had no choice but to come to you for help." The king took a deep breath and said, We will certainly help you. However, we must first assess the situation fully. This matter does not seem trivial, and we need to uncover the truth." The king's voice was full of seriousness, indicating that he was taking the issue very seriously and would do everything possible to resolve it. The woman's eyes were filled with confusion, and her husband laughed as he said, "I told you, didn't I? You must be imagining things. Maybe it's because you didn't sleep well last night. After you prepare breakfast, go ahead and rest." And with that he dismissed her. "But, Your Majesty, I saw the child with my own eyes lying on the bed, and the fact that he disappeared so suddenly was utterly baffling. I kept wondering, how could the child just vanish? Surely someone must have come and taken him away." My mind was swirling with questions. My gaze instinctively went to the door, which was firmly closed. Then a strange fear crept into my heart. I felt as if something in the house was causing these events. I had an unsettling sense that there were hidden secrets within that house that I could not yet understand. Immediately, I turned to my husband and said, "I can't stay in this house. I'm too scared. Please take me to my mother's house, and I'll stay there during the day. Then I'll return to you at night." My husband, suddenly angry, replied, "Have you lost your mind? A newlywed wife stays in her husband's house, not her mother's. If you're scared here, how will you live your life? I don't have the money to buy another house for you. You must stay in this house, so spend the day alone and get used to it." His words only terrified me more. I kept rejecting his suggestion, but he refused to listen to me. After breakfast, he left, and I was left alone in the house. It was very difficult for me, as I had never lived alone before marriage. I had never imagined that I would feel this kind of fear after marriage. But the child, whom I had seen with my own eyes, and whose sudden disappearance had kept me awake, had disturbed my peace. A wave of fear surged through my mind, and I stayed in my place, not having the courage to leave the room. But the day went on, and I still had household chores to do. My husband was supposed to return by evening, so I had to get the work done. With Allah's name on my lips, I stepped out of the room and began my chores. While cooking in the kitchen, I suddenly felt as though someone was standing behind me. I quickly turned around, and my eyes widened in terror. There stood a very handsome man who looked extraordinarily attractive. For a moment, I was lost in his appearance, but then I quickly snapped back to reality. I understood that if this man was in my house, it was a grave mistake. If my husband had come and seen me with this stranger, who knew what he would think? How would I explain talking to this strange man on our second day of marriage? We hadn't spoken much yet, and it would be natural for my husband to suspect me. I was terrified and immediately looked at the man, saying, "Why are you here? Who are you? Why do you want to ruin my life? I just got married, and my husband will never forgive me for this. Please, have mercy on me and leave." The man smiled and said, "I didn't come here to leave. I came to take you with me. The moment I saw you, I fell in love with you. I want to spend my life with you. If you don't agree, remember this. Your life will become the worst it could be. You will pray for death, but you won't get it." Upon hearing this, my condition worsened. I was completely terrified, and I didn't know what to do. The man was extremely confident, and there was a certain intensity in his eyes. I replied again, "I will not go with you, nor will I love you. I want to stay loyal to my husband." But the man, with an expression of disdain, kept smiling. There was a gleam in his eyes that sent a wave of fear over me. I didn't know how to handle this situation, or where this was going to end. I didn't want any more problems to arise for me, so I quickly tried to calm myself. But suddenly, he burst into a strange laughter and continued to smile. He took a step back, and as he reached the hallway, he disappeared in an instant. I rushed to the hallway, but he was nowhere to be found. He had vanished like some strange creature, and I was left in a state of intense fear. For a long while, I sat on the bed sobbing uncontrollably. A deep fear had gripped my heart, and I felt utterly helpless. Finally, I decided that I had to go to my mother's house. Wrapping myself in a shawl, I left the house. When my husband returned that night and found me missing, he rushed to my mother's house. There, he scolded me for coming all the way there alone. But I couldn't say a word. I didn't have the courage to tell him about the terrifying event I had just experienced. Days passed, and I returned home with my husband. A few days went by normally, but then the strange occurrences started happening again. Sometimes the same child would appear. Sometimes unusual noises would echo through the house. Finally, I told my husband everything, because I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. I told him that mysterious things were happening in our house, but he just dismissed me, saying, "You're saying all these weird things. You've gone mad. There's no problem here." He refused to accept that something serious was happening in his house, and this issue was now affecting my life. Then, one night, my life changed completely. The jinn, who had come in the form of a handsome man, returned to torment me. I came out of my room to get some water, and there he was again, sitting in front of me. He smiled at me and said, "Today, I will do everything with you that I've always wanted. I am your lover, and I've come to take you with me. If you don't want to come with me, today I will turn your husband into a dog, and I'll do everything with you tonight." Hearing this, I trembled with fear. I immediately fell at his feet, pleading, "No, please, don't do this to me. You are a jinn. You will have many girls to come to you, and you can enjoy the night with them. But please, don't ruin my life. Don't do this to my husband. You say you love me, but those who love don't behave like this." I tried to appeal emotionally, but he ignored my words, laughing mockingly. Suddenly, he grabbed me, and without my consent began doing everything he had intended to. Majesty, he took over my body as though I was his property. After fulfilling his desires, he stepped back and suddenly vanished from the house. I returned to the room crying, but when I saw the scene before me, my soul trembled with horror. I couldn't believe that something like this could actually happen. Majesty, instead of my husband lying on the bed, there was that same dog. The jinn had kept his word and had turned my husband into a dog. Majesty, my life is ruined. I have nothing left. This jinn has left me with nothing. Majesty, I beg you to bring my husband back. My marriage is still so young, and I just want to restore my life. I promise I will leave this city and this house. Just, please, do whatever it takes to bring my husband back." The woman was sobbing as she shared her predicament with the king. The king's eyes were filled with surprise, for he had never heard of such an event before. However, he composed himself and comforted the woman, assuring her that he would send her away for now. After the court session ended, the king sat in his private room, reflecting on the events shared by his minister. The minister had described witnessing a house with many dogs, where two men were stroking the dogs' backs and arguing over how they could ruin the lives of others' wives, sending their husbands away to enemy lands and destroying their lives. From the minister's description, the king immediately realized that these events were being orchestrated by the two men. He decided to wait until nightfall, as he wanted to catch them in the act and return the wives to their homes. In the second half of the night, the king, accompanied by his minister and soldiers, set out for the house, knowing that the two men typically disappeared during the day and returned only at night. When the king and minister arrived at the house, they saw the two men laughing and joking while stroking the backs of the dogs. But as soon as they saw the king and minister, they froze, their faces filled with terror, and immediately tried to flee. The king commanded his soldiers to capture both men, and they were thrown into the royal prison. The king's eyes were filled with rage and sorrow as he realized that some people were trampling on the very principles of humanity to satisfy their desires. He reflected on the extent to which these men had fallen, destroying innocent lives for their own gratification, and now conspiring against the kingdom. The next morning, as the court session began, the king summoned the two men, along with the woman who had suffered because of them. When the woman saw their faces, she once again trembled with fear. She immediately stood before the king and spoke, "Majesty, these are the same jinn who violated me and turned my husband into a dog." The king's anger soared to the heavens. He turned sharply toward the two men and said, "Tell us the truth, all of it. If you try to hide anything, remember, we will make you face a death you cannot even imagine." Upon hearing the king's words, one of the men fell to his knees and said, "Majesty, as you command, it will be done. We confess our sins, but please spare our lives. We swear we will never repeat this again." He revealed the truth, stating that they were not jinn, but humans who had been committing such acts in many places. They had dishonored the wives of innocent men and sent their husbands away to foreign lands, all while conspiring against the kingdom for their own selfish interests. Their goal was to destroy the kingdom for their own benefit. The king's anger intensified. He stood up from his throne and bellowed, "Immediately bring back all the men you sent away. Otherwise, we will make sure you face a death more horrific than anything you have ever imagined." The man, trembling, lowered his head and replied, "Majesty, as you command, it will be done." The king, not giving him a moment to speak further, waved his hand dismissively, saying, "Bring back the men first, and then we will decide your fate." The king ordered some of his soldiers to go after the men who had been sent away and bring them back. Soon, a few men returned, but some did not. Some had converted to other religions and joined the foreign lands, while others had been martyred in battle. Finally, the man who had been the subject of the woman's complaint returned. The king swiftly ordered the execution of the two men, as the kingdom's laws stipulated that those who engaged in adultery were not entitled to live. After the event in the court, the woman, grateful and relieved, returned home with her husband. This event proved a powerful lesson. Sometimes what appears to be true is not the whole truth. Behind every situation there are many hidden secrets. If one believes only what the eyes see, without seeking the truth, they can easily fall prey to fear and deceit.